Welcome to the High Performance Edge, the podcast for contractors who lead with building science and want to turn that advantage into a stronger, more successful business. Whether you're in HVAC, insulation, solar, or home performance, we dig into strategy, sales, marketing, operations, hiring, and customer service approaches that power stable, more profitable companies. Hear from top contractors and industry experts as we explore what it takes to thrive as a very different kind of contractor. Here's your host, founder and CEO of Energy Circle, Peter Troast.
Hey folks, thanks for being here. Today's episode is a little different. It's just me. From time to time, I'll be doing solo casts to dig into topics that I think deserve a deeper dive. The kinds of things that don't always fit neatly into a guest conversation, but are too important to ignore. My goal with these is simple: be as useful as possible and give you actionable takeaways you can use in your business right away. This time, we're taking on one of the biggest market shifts affecting high-performance contractors: how to hold your ground and ideally thrive when private equity-backed competitors start flooding your market. We'll talk about why private equity loves HVAC, how it changes the game for independent contractors, and how to turn your locally owned status, quality-first mindset, and customer loyalty into a competitive edge that actually matters. I'll even get into the math of why private equity plays this game in the first place and where their vulnerabilities might be. If you're facing private equity competitors, want to be smart about how you take them on, and maybe take a little satisfaction in being David going up against Goliath, this one's for you. Let's dive in. Okay. So today's topic is really about what tactics can folks use when sort of the inevitable comes to your market, which is that some of your significant competitors get acquired by private equity and then start acting in different, sometimes unpredictable, sometimes almost always more aggressive kinds of ways. And so that's how we're going to tackle this today. I just want to point out that, we have been talking a lot about the concept of differentiation, or the importance of differentiation. And this is just another piece of that, right? I mean, how should you be facing competitors in your market that are backed by private equity and are doing the things that private equity backed companies do? The key, and that's what we'll talk about today, is how do you separate yourself so that you stand out in a way that is meaningful to consumers. But I don't want to claim that, this is not the only way to do it. We've talked a lot about a variety of things in terms of differentiation, and there's a whole bunch of past webinars about just generally the importance, the kind of branding. Last week, we talked about quality, especially in the heat pump market, as a kind of differentiator. And there's a variety of content out there. So this is, to me, like one piece of that overall discussion. So the way I want to tackle this today is, we'll just review briefly the insatiable appetite that private equity seems to have for HVAC and kind of what the state of the state is there. And then I want to lean in a little bit to sort of what the tactics are that we tend to see and where we see some vulnerabilities by, companies that have been bought by PE. What's important, obviously, to this whole discussion is, does it make any difference, right, to consumers? Is there any appreciation on the side of consumers? And there's not a lot out there about our industry specifically, but we could talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk about positioning. How do you tell your story? What is your kind of differentiated story, and how aggressive do you want to be about that? And then we'll wrap up with some kind of specific marketing tactics. Before I begin, I just want to say that if you have built a company over a long period of time and someone comes along and is going to write you a check for 8 or 10 times your EBITDA, power to you. So I don't want to in any way come across here as like I'm against people who have built businesses, worked their whole lives to build up something that has value and is going to take advantage of the fact that someone else wants to own your company. Power to you. Now, having said that, I am a sucker for a fight with Goliath, and so when more often than not, Energy Circle's clients are not the private equity acquired companies. They're the ones doing battle against the private equity. And that gets my blood flowing because big, well-funded aggressive competitors are kind of what we live to go up against. So again, I'm not in any way sort of against this, but when given the chance to market against private equity, that's what we're going to talk about today. So I think we all kind of know this. We dug around a little bit to try to get some stats about it. The extent to which private equity is really kind of penetrated HVAC, we all kind of know it, I think, in our local markets, but when we sort of step back and kind of look at it globally, there are now what are referred to in this kind of world as platform companies. So a platform would be, to use like the Sela Services example, company that was rolled up. Sela Services rolled up a whole bunch of folks and continues to roll up those. And Sela, in this case, is the platform. It does not necessarily mean that acquired companies take on the brand of that platform, but it's typically that platform is what it is. And as of this report, there's 155 of these kind of platform companies that are owned by private equity and are kind of building out a platform. And all of them make different decisions about how they're going to go to brand and so forth. And then when you add kind of what they call add-on acquisitions, there's 517 of those. And so I'm just looking at the residential column in this particular case. What is quite extraordinary, and this is just HVAC Services market share report from this company, Mordor Intelligence, that they believe, or they're stating in this report, that private equity-backed platforms now control $10 to $15 billion of the overall HVAC market of 30 to 40 billion. So on the low end, a third of the entire market of HVAC companies in residential in residential and more than just residential are kind of owned by private equity. So pretty extraordinary. Some of you may subscribe, and I highly recommend it, to the HVAC Pros newsletter. Very good job that the folks at that publication are doing. One of the things they have is this HVAC M&A tracker. And so, when I'm just looking at a fraction of the first part of 2025, where they've listed all the companies that have been acquired, and it's this, if you follow this spreadsheet on a regular basis, it's often 5, 6, 7, as many as kind of 10 acquisitions that happen every month by a whole variety of kind of platform companies that you can see in this buyer column. So a lot out there that's going on. And, the big one that we've all gotten a lot of attention recently is the Sela Services. So Sela, started out, rolled up a bunch of companies. Sela sold, once they had done that, to Morgan Stanley as kind of the buyer of that platform. And then at the end of last year, Morgan Stanley sold the whole thing to Goldman Sachs. And so it just gives you this sense when it's the giant fish of Goldman Sachs sort of eating the slightly smaller fish, in this case, Morgan Stanley, it just sort of gives you a very clear sense of kind of the level and magnitude of what's going on in this sector. There wasn't a kind of complete transparency about all the numbers along the way here, but it looks like Goldman Sachs paid about 1.7, or they valued it at 1.7 billion, about 17 times EBITDA. So of what had been kind of a roll-up of about $100 million company. This is the way private equity works, right? There are some very healthy margins being paid by these companies for your HVAC company. Things in the kind of, you hear everything from sort of 5 up to 10 times EBITDA, but the way private equity is working is it is rolling these things up so that they can get an even greater multiple, like a 17 times multiple in this case, which is pretty extraordinary, at the next level of the kind of the sale. So that's it. I don't think it's going to stop. So let's talk a little bit about what is it about HVAC companies that PE likes, and can we then map some of those things, right, to particular vulnerabilities? And so I don't necessarily need to go down this whole thing in a ton of detail, but clearly recurring revenue is one of the things that they really like. And so one of the things that results in a higher valuation for HVAC companies are those that have a significant number of maintenance contracts and have that kind of recurring revenue. Obviously, they think that they treat HVAC as an essential service that's not super recession oriented. It's fragmented, so classic roll up opportunity. They look at HVAC companies and immediately see chances to save margin or to improve margins. They look at the overall sector with efficiency issues and heat pump adoption and so forth as good things. And they see the opportunity to exit the way that exit happened from Sela to Morgan Stanley to Goldman Sachs. So I always think it's good to go to the numbers, and I won't go through this in excruciating detail, but when a private equity firm looks at an HVAC company, they are only interested in the opportunity that they have to improve those margins, right? To take the bottom line and improve it. And this is sort of what the numbers typically look like, which is that they think they can improve cost of goods sold, and that's largely coming from making big deals with manufacturers around equipment. And so what you'll often see is that after an acquisition, we're going to switch everything over to Carrier because that particular platform has made a deal with Carrier and they're getting better prices. So that might take 2 points off of your cost of goods sold, boost your gross profit. It is pretty clear that one of their objectives is to reduce labor costs, and so they would try to bring down labor costs altogether, either by just pressure on wages. Oftentimes, and we see this day in and day out, there is a significant increase in the amount of money that's getting spent on advertising. So that oftentimes is an increase. They hope that these kind of roll up things give them some overhead reductions, and maybe take a couple points off of there. There is a shift where these private equity firms want to get paid, so there's often management fees or executive fees that are in there that might boost. But what that offsets is what might have happened in an owner situation where there was some compensation to the owner of, like, said, 10%. So in this made up model here, you could potentially take what would be like a net profit of about 10% and boost that to 15 or maybe even up to 20%. And that's kind of the mental sort of look that a private equity firm approaches an HVAC company as to why this is going to work. So what I like to do then is sort of take those goals and look at where we might have vulnerability. And clearly, when on the wage side of things and kind of pushing techs even harder and so forth, that becomes kind of a real opportunity for independents to recruit. And so one of the things we've heard repeatedly is that recruiting tends to get quite a bit easier in markets that have a lot of private equity ownership. There is aggressive upselling. And so there's a ton of pressure both to sell memberships, but also very often to cross-sell additional services like plumbing and like electric that are there. And so I'm not saying, we all want to upsell too, but at the same time, this is a competitive difference if you can go in with a more kind of no pressure approach. Lots of emphasis, lots of indication that service gets kind of inconsistent. Every one of these platforms makes their own decision about branding. Many of them retain the brand of the local companies. Maybe, there's individual decisions getting done, but they inevitably tend to get a little more cookie cutter in their approach. They tend to have like a single web platform. It all looks the same except for a logo in the corner. So there's an opportunity there. Churn, becomes a thing, right? Because customer churn is a serious vulnerability that happens. And then the other piece is that, this is the part we see, is that there's very kind of high spend and somewhat scattershot marketing, right? And so this is where they get very aggressive at the end of the month to try to make their numbers, or the end of a quarter to make their numbers. And we can fight up against that. So those are, I just like to go to the root here and see what it is that is driving this and look for kind of where some of those opportunities are for us. Okay. Do customers have any appreciation? And we always go to look for what research may exist about what consumer attitudes are. There isn't really a ton of it, but I do think that the important point here is that the private equity has sort of sunk its teeth into our lives, all of our lives, in a wide variety of ways. And probably what is more felt by consumers is all the things related to healthcare and dental and hospitals and so forth, and that becomes quite obvious. There's a bunch of really kind of very academic studies out there, but the end conclusion of which is, generally speaking, consumers view private equity ownership more negatively than kind of other ownership types, right? And so there is some out there. What we've been doing is looking to Reddit, which is a very interesting source of information about when the conversation about private equity starts to happen in a locality. And this example here is Seattle, and this is a person who's like taking a more aggressive stand here of, please stop supporting home service companies that are owned by private equity. But these are pretty popular threads. Like this one's got 151 comments. It's got 417 sort of ups and downs. It's there's a lot there. More importantly, though, what we've been doing is sort of like downloading all these kind of Reddit conversations, because this is the place where we tend to see it most. You also tend to see a little bit of mention sometimes in negative reviews about it. But these are the kinds of like sentiment analysis things that we've been sort of mining to try to get inside the head of a real customer who might not even know what private equity means. They might not use the term private equity. And you'll notice in this particular example of a bunch of comments that we just used AI to kind of consolidate into sentiment analysis. There's not, the term private equity isn't here, but there is a lot of reference to upselling and to raising prices and to pushy salesy, and to pushing larger replacements when a less expensive fix could fit the problem. They train solely on selling more product. So high interest rates is something that you tend to, you hear a fair amount about in these chat things. Pushing monthly warranty plans, maybe doing some sort of like shady activities. I don't know if this is true or not, but they, harvest online reviews to make them kind of legit. In any given market, when we're doing, working on behalf of a client, this is the kind of stuff that we're doing to try to really understand and get into local mindsets about how people think about this and what might be kind of resonant messages. If you decide, you want to kind of be more aggressive, if you will, about this, there's choices to be made about how aggressive you really want to be. And I'm just trying to, frame this in very simplistic kind of terms, but if you want to take the super aggressive approach and this could be, well, we're not owned by Goldman Sachs, right? We're not controlled by Wall Street. We're not run for investor profits. That is those kinds of statements are taking a fairly aggressive stance that is aggressive against companies that friends of yours that have run these companies and ended up selling them. That is an option, but it's a fairly aggressive one. A medium ground might be just not naming Goldman Sachs, or not being sort of like too aggressive about the menace that is Wall Street, or the menace that is Goldman Sachs. It's not owned by private equity, not owned by out-of-town investors, not beholden to remote investors. That's one of the things in that sentiment analysis that we've kind of noticed a fair amount of, is this idea of kind of outside investors, like that there's suddenly a new sort of someone new in the mix related to that company that's reporting. That the soft is probably not the right terminology for what this is, but the more easier, more straightforward, less offensive, less aggressive approach is just to really lean hard into locally owned and operated, and local service, local people, locally owned. And I think that, I don't mean any of these to be necessarily mutually exclusive, but the starting point of like what you want your overall positioning to be kind of starts with this kind of a discussion. And I would sort of say that everybody who is locally owned and is in a market that is, that is getting dominated by PE companies ought to lean pretty hard into this locally owned and operated type of messaging, because people like that. People want to support local people want to support locally owned companies, and then make decisions about whether or not you want to go, harder and more aggressive. So let's, I think, now just talk a little bit at the end about sort of some specific marketing tactics. And when I say outgunned, it is, when these PE firms push marketing budgets to up to maybe 10 to 15% of revenue. And I think we've talked a lot about what marketing budgets ought to be, and it's pretty standard and typical for a contracting business to be around 7%. We are definitely, it's hard to know. All we know is how much they're spending. And we've seen situations where, reasonable Google Ads budgets that might have been, for a good, decent sized company might have been in the $15,000 a month in Google Ads spend, getting pushed almost all the way to $100,000 a month. We've seen that. And so the question is, what do you do? You're not going to go toe to toe with them. You'd be foolish to kind of spend that much money. And sometimes that money is being spent aggressively in a very competitive way to do harm, right? And to really try to sort of be aggressive and harmful to existing firms. What do you do to fight that? And so our kind of approach when this is in our world is that we are not in the paid search area, which is kind of where the big dollars tend to get spent and tend to get allocated. We're not in any way trying to go, match them dollar for dollar. That's a fool's errand. It's not a good thing. What is working in those situations is just to be better. They tend, to a certain extent, we've seen in many cases, to be a bit generic about the kinds of search terms that they use. They are doing a splatter approach. They're trying to get get the phone to ring for anything and everything that they possibly can. And to the extent that we can stay very focused on precise, super targeted keywords, long tail keywords, that has been very effective. Now you can also compete on those other company names, right? And so you can have messaging in Google Ads for one of those competitors' branded search terms that speaks to kind of your being locally owned and so forth. So there's things to be done there. I think that often the websites that we look at, when we're sort of evaluating folks that want to come work with Energy Circle and are just kind of generally looking at the industry, the local oriented branding that really leans into those local messaging, I think is very often on a website one of the big missed opportunities. That there's a real chance here, I think, to lean into that local message, and often folks, we see that it's just kind of missed opportunity. Social media is an excellent place to do this, right? Your social media is where you're trying to get the brand, message out about your company, and this is a great place to emphasize local, to emphasize your employees. I said this before, consumers really do like to help local companies. And if you, as part of the request for a review, if you mention the idea that, hey, we're competing with these big, companies owned by Wall Street, and it would be really great if you could mention something about us being locally owned, that's a kind of a no-brainer. It's a really, really good. Anything you can do in community engagement, obviously, big companies can do this too, and they're going to lean into trying to look more local than they really are. But you've got to combat that. And then there's lots to be done in content, right? And I think, again, I would lean first with that softer messaging about locally owned. But if you want to get more aggressive, there's tons of chances in blog posts and various other things to say, what does it mean to buy your heat pumps from a private equity owned company? And then lastly, I just want to emphasize, and we've heard this in spades from our clients, is that to the extent that you are still hiring, that you are looking for folks, people in those acquired companies tend to start to feel some pain. I don't mean to say that those are bad places to work. They know retention is critical to them, and they do some smart things around compensation and and in order to kind of give people golden handcuffs. But there's also kind of a lot of chance to do that. So let me stop there. I know we're kind of right at time. Take care, everybody. Thank you for being here.
The High Performance Edge podcast is brought to you by our company, Energy Circle, the marketing agency that for 15 years has served the most successful high-performance contractors in the country. Curious about whether we might be a good fit for your marketing and website needs? It begins with a no-obligation, no hard sales discussion of your business and goals and an honest assessment of whether we can make an outsized impact on your company. Check out energycircle.com or email me directly at peter@energycircle.com.